Part of the problem is that when anybody talks about behaviour, usually it's a negative context. We don't think about behaviour as also a neutral and a positive thing as well. When you do have that idealised image of what behaviour should look like, and then you have someone who maybe expresses what you deem as a negative thing, you automatically assume it is a negative thing. Trauma amongst neurodivergent people can express itself in a very different way than how it can express itself in non-neurodivergent populations. Masking is a perfect example of that, because once you get beyond the code switching and everything that everybody does as human behaviours, when you get to the extremities of autistic masking, when you're adding stuff to that, all of that is fueled by trauma. Yet for a non-autistic person, you're looking at a traumatized person, but you don't see the trauma because they're acting like you. That is the trauma expressing itself. Wrapping your head around that is quite a complex thing, quite a difficult thing to process, especially when you come from that kind of non-autistic, non-neurodivergent perspective, because you only have your own frame of reference for what trauma looks like. And if you're looking at a marginalized group whose voice isn't listened to, and you're, through your privilege and whatever, you're not listening to them, you're only ever going to apply your perspective and your frame of reference to their existence. And that's why we end up with the problems that we do.
And there's such a resistance to people understanding that there's not an epidemic, there's nothing in the water, there's nothing going on to cause autism. It's that we have a greater understanding now of what autism looks like. And when our professionals, our educators, our healthcare professionals, all of the most significant professionals working with us, our families, our children, lack the understanding and lack the acceptance, then we're actually contributing to those mental health conditions and those barriers and those co-occurring conditions. Because over time, many of us develop co-occurring conditions like autoimmune disease because we are so burnt out, because we haven't had access to the care that we need, the support we need. And when we don't have professionals to guide us through exploration of our autistic identity and our support needs, how do we know where to start? So I'd really encourage you, if you are not familiar with autism in adults, do some reading, ask some questions, watch some videos. There are so many fantastic, not only advocates online, but just autistic adults who write, who create content about their lives and what they live with. And it's so important to be able to identify this, because also it gives a lot of really useful information about the future that our children potentially have. Autistic adults and what that looks like. And obviously it looks like a whole range of different things because we're all people and we're all different. So here's part of the problem, right? The criteria around autism for the longest time is based around behaviour in children. And for the longest time, we've continued to base it off, Kanner's 1943 paper on autistic children. And we also based it off the findings of Hans Asperger when we were still using the term Asperger, separate from autism, which we don't do anymore. So a lot of people look at people like me when it's said that we're autistic, and they have such a resistance to believe that because they don't see any of the stereotypical behaviours. So you won't see me stimming in public, or you might if you know what you're looking at. If you have a radar, if you're autistic, you'd probably know straight away. But there's an expectation that adults will get around behaving in the same way that children with significant support needs who are autistic behave. Now, here's the thing about that. Sometimes when an autistic person has higher support needs and requires care, there is a greater disconnect between their mind and body, their brain and body. So they lack the control to stop themselves from engaging in certain behaviours, particularly sensory-driven behaviours. So, doing things that we would consider dangerous, walking out in front of cars or putting their hands in fire or jumping into water or perhaps smearing their feces or getting into hot oil on the stove or whatever it is. Sometimes people who have significant support needs, their bodies do not follow the intention of their minds. So we're still creating therapies around correcting that, which is a bit counterproductive really because it's a lifelong thing. Now, the problem here is that, again, people who don't really understand or know autism are looking for the same kinds of behaviours or autistic expressions or presentations in adults. And the truth is, you probably won't find that unless an adult has significant support needs, high support needs requiring care. Now, here's the thing about this. We tend to, with adults, because we've missed so much of what autism actually is for such a long time, we tend to focus, or healthcare professionals tend to focus on isolated characteristics of autism. So a person might present to a GP and say, I'm anxious all the time. So the GP is going to treat the anxiety. It would be very rare for them to say, okay, let's explore the possibility that you might be on the autism spectrum, because really they'd have no reason to do that. However, we know that ongoing anxiety can be a characteristic of the bigger picture that is autism. Now, my good friend Pia, who is a PhD student at the moment, just co-wrote an article about autistic adults and barriers to healthcare, and it was just phenomenal. So what was uncovered is that the first barrier for autistic adults in healthcare is the lack of understanding and knowledge of what autism is and how it looks in healthcare professionals from their perspective. So our first port of call is usually a GP, or we might ask for a referral to a psych or a psychiatrist. And many people assume that these people would for sure know about autism. What you'll find is they might know about Kanner's version of autism, the 1943 document, but they won't necessarily know about the 2013 DSM-5 updated revised edition of selection criteria. I like to say selection criteria, because not many people would, unless it's your special interest or your passion. You're probably not going to go exploring, learning everything there is to learn about autism. So a lot of people do go to a GP saying, I'd like a referral, I'd like to be assessed for autism. I've been thinking for a while now. Sometimes it's parents of children who have been diagnosed. And healthcare professionals are very, very quick to say, if you can drive a car, if you can study, if you can get through life, if you can speak, then you can't be autistic. If you're social, you can't be autistic. I've had it said to me, you're too warm to be autistic. And here's the thing about being autistic. It's a very hard thing to express when somebody says, so what does it mean? How are you autistic? Well, that's like me asking a non-autistic person, well, how are you neurotypical? Or how are you non-autistic? How do you encompass all that information? And it's different for every person. So that's a problem. Another barrier was being able to access healthcare. So the environments of doctors' surgeries, very loud, long waiting periods, and again, the lack of understanding or knowledge of autism means that in consultation with a GP or somebody, there's going to be communication barriers and misunderstandings. And I know for me, I rarely go to GPs because I've had a really hard time and been really let down, and it took me into my adult life to be diagnosed with several co-occurring conditions because I was never taken seriously. And as an adult, the first thing that happens is no matter what I present with, no matter what I say I'm there for, as soon as they find out that I'm the parent of children who are autistic, they come to the conclusion that my symptoms are psychosomatic, all in my head, because I'm living with copious amounts of stress as a result of parenting autistic children. So they completely dismiss and overlook my identity as a person, and I don't get the help I need. And that really sucks. And so many families go through that. Do you know that autistic adults are 4 times more likely to suffer from depression? Autistic adults are 16 times more likely to die from suicide. Autistic people have a significantly shorter lifespan. We're lucky to make it to our 40s. And those are current stats. Heart disease, epilepsy, and suicide. Now, when you go through your whole life knowing you are different, and we do know we're different.
Too loud, too quiet, too fast, too me. Too much to love, apparently. Too tall, too short, too fat, too thin. I just don't know how to fit in. Labels that define my soul in negative terms, like an ugly troll. Fit in, be this, be that, be there. I really wish I didn't care. The words I've heard throughout my life, as a tiny child, as a mother and wife, the words that are spoken within my work, they sit there accusing, a stinging hurt. It isn't me that needs to change. I am not odd or even strange. I am a loving, sentient being. I wish that you could all start seeing. Yvonne Rayleigh.
You know, we all come from somewhere. And I don't have any judgment about that, but I do want to share some of the things that I regularly feel triggered by and really struggle with. And I think it's important because I'm always so mindful of not having others feel shamed or called out or embarrassed or upset. I never want people to come to my page or into our community and feel anything that would send them away. I never want that. But I also do feel a responsibility as an autistic person, particularly with a PDA expression, to share some of the things that I really struggle with. What I find upsetting or triggering for me personally is when members of my community, autistic people, people who are diagnosed PDA, ADHD, we share stories from our lives. We give insights into how our brains operate, our neurodivergence, and then people comment or they share our content and say things like, well, now that you understand how your brain works, you can see that it's irrational and you can change your thinking or you can change your behaviours. Oh, I'm sorry. I am sorry, but it almost makes me want to cry. It's so ableist. It's completely dismissive of the disability. But my heart breaks every time I see an autistic person's way of showing up in the world as being non-functional, described as non-functional, irrational. My neurobiology as an autistic person is 100% functional. The way I move my body, the way I process my environment, the way I am in the world is 100% functional. I get to thrive today. I get to be happy. I get to be self-accepting because I love who I am. And I get to love who I am because I'm surrounded by an entire community of other autistic adults. And I can guarantee you now that every single one of those people I'm connected with has suffered and struggled and battled their way through life. To be engaged inside of our community, we're only seeing surface level stuff. When people read our posts, that stuff is skimming the surface of what we've been through to get to where we are now. And this is not a rant about being on my pity pot. It's not about self-pity. It's about being real. All of my kin in the autistic community, including families of my kin, are subjected to gaslighting and ignorance every single day. And then people don't understand why autistic people show up in the world angry and defensive and on high alert and traumatized. They don't understand why PDA adults might snap at people. And it's because we're constantly exposed to things that hurt us, but we find a way to sit with the discomfort and push through it. And we've been doing that our whole lives. And it starts in childhood. So many children begging not to go to school, begging to be able to move their bodies in the way that they need to. And by the way, I'm sitting here doing this at the moment. I'm not trying to hide it. It just happens to be off camera. I stim, I rock, I make unusual sounds with my mouth. And I hid that stuff all of my life because I didn't want to be targeted. And the outcome of that was that I targeted myself. I turned on myself. We get to a space where we don't want to go on anymore. We don't want to live anymore. Because there are so many expectations placed upon us. There is so much pressure placed upon us. And even today, even when people are diagnosed, which means they fit a criteria that outlines challenges. I mean, the word disorder is attached to us. Disability. Autism is a disability.
And at some point, it's just too much. And then you go into shutdown, freeze.
People see adults like myself sitting here articulating. It seems as though, we have this almost gifted expressive language, but that's because we're often traumatized and very sensitive, and we carefully select our words. We're very crafty in how, crafted, skilled in how we formulate our language. This is characteristic of being autistic. It's not proof that we're not autistic. And I find it so dismissive when people hear examples of what it is to be autistic and then challenge us to not be autistic anymore. They read something we've written or hear something that we've shared from our own experience and go, well, now that you know how you operate, you can take that information and change how you respond. No. Actually, no. The reason that we share our stories is so that members of the community, professionals, our families, friends, our partners, gain an insight and an understanding of how our brains work. Being autistic, being PDA, being ADHD, those aren't conscious choices. Those are not, they're not identities and cultures we take on because we choose to. We don't go, oh, I'm going to behave autistic today and tell the world I'm autistic. Or I'm going to just, a lot of people actually come to the conclusion that people like me are attention seeking and want to be special. I've seen this written underneath little documentaries I've been a part of. I've seen psychiatrists come in and say those things about people in my community that have a similar autistic expression to me. These are professionals saying things like, these women are not autistic. They're probably something else, but they're definitely attention seeking. Oh, Lord. And we hear this all the time. All the time. So not only have we gone our entire lives being misunderstood and judged and not understanding ourselves, particularly when we're diagnosed as adults, we continuously hear this. Continuously. So I try not to follow where my content is shared and read those comments. But I did today, and I did see somebody saying that PDA thinking is irrational and that once we understand our thinking, we can change it. Well, then, let me tell you, if I could change my thinking, change my being, and change my doing, and not be who I am, then I just wouldn't be autistic. There's masking, there's changing the outer expression of how I show up in the world so that you will accept me, so that I will fit in, but I will never be happy that way. I was never happy masking, ever. And today, autistic people are still encouraged to mask. Our children are still encouraged to mask. When we ask our children to sit at a desk for 6 hours a day and not move and quiet hands, we're shutting down who people are. We wonder why the world is filled with traumatized autistic adults. My brain is not irrational. My brain is perfectly rational. Rational is a subjective term. It's subjective. What's rational for me may be different to what's rational for you. And that, my friends, is what diversity is. Neurodiversity. When we talk about neurodiversity, we are not just talking about the difference between diagnoses. We're not just talking about autistic people and non-autistic people. We're talking about different brains. We're talking about variety in cognitive processing, neurobiology, bodies, brains, beings, central nervous systems. I wish this war would end. I wish it would just end. It hurts me so much to see my autistic community in so much pain, so much of the time. So much pain, so much sadness, so much rejection, so much unidentified, undiagnosed, intergenerational trauma. It's there. You know, there are so many threads of trauma throughout our bloodlines as autistic people because there are so many people in our family history that are undiagnosed and unidentified neurodivergent. And that just continues to move down the line, down the bloodlines, until someone really feels it. And someone stands up and says, you know, I'm gonna get to the bottom of this. And that is where you find autistic adults online with pages, sharing their stories, putting ourselves out there to be judged and abused and misunderstood. And it's not just autistic people, it's their families as well. It's our families, our mothers and our fathers and our siblings and our carers being gaslit and blamed for our neurobiology. And today I'm just really feeling it. I'm really feeling it. I'm still doing this. Big deep breath. Any therapy that uses terms like quiet hands, sit on your hands, that seeks to teach our children to be extremely different than who they are organically and inherently is dangerous. And it's often sold to our families at a time where we are so vulnerable and so scared and so uninformed. And we jump in there. I was one of those parents. We jump in there and we put our children in therapies that give them this really strong messaging that they're not okay as they are. Supportive therapies all the way, figuring out their unique needs and supporting them, not changing them, not fixing them, not trying to make them not autistic. I want people to know that autistic people are the most incredibly beautiful, selfless, deep thinking, deep feeling, burdened, social justice warriors, always outstretching their hand. And when they don't, and when they're angry, and when they're triggered, they're traumatized. They're tired. And we all know what that's like. My brain is not irrational. It is completely functional. It responds to my environment in the way that it knows how. My body, my brain is hypersensitive for a reason. My feelings are deep and my thinking is deep. And my neurobiology requires extreme protection. My being requires extreme self-preservation, because we are taught from a very young age that our no does not matter. Our no is often changed to a yes. And this is true for many children. Autistic people often are riddled with self-doubt. We are often confused around the definition of healthy relationships because we haven't been exposed to many of those, because we've been forced into social skills groups. And the desperation around us having social networks has meant that we've been encouraged to disconnect from who we are, disconnect from being able to attract people who are like us, who we are genuinely interested in, and just attach to anybody who will accept us. That's what social skills groups can often teach autistic children. And then we find ourselves in unhealthy relationships, and that continues into romantic relationships, and on it goes. So, my thinking is not irrational. My thinking is the result of many things. My neurobiology is perfect and intelligent and wise and smart. My central nervous system is sensitive, and my brain knows exactly what to do to protect it. My behaviour is completely functional. The way I move my body is how I regulate my emotions. When I'm excited, when I'm nervous, when I'm anxious, when I'm happy, when I feel joy, my autistic body is perfect as it is. I am not non-functional. I am not a second-rate version of a non-autistic person. I am a proud, perfect and whole autistic person. And thank you for being here to support me this morning in a time of vulnerability.